Hates, what we've been trying to do. We've asserted for a long time that this was an unlawful tax, and the Supreme Court agreed with us. And the Supreme Court also um, reinforced principles of rule of law, which I think we all depend on. I think the impact of the case on our company will be to get us some money back, which we can use, and hopefully it will lead to a deceleration of this asphyxiating tax. We have to pay the tax. We have no way to pay it except to pass it along. Our tax rate on our company last year exceeded 100%. So we can't handle it all ourselves. It's too much.
I do want to follow up on the refunds, but again, the White House had a comeback. President Trump followed this up with a 10% tariff. Will this make any difference to your bottom line? Because he's really hit back in a broad way here.
Well, it cuts the prevailing tax rate in half. So certainly I'll take that. That's helpful. The 122 tariffs last for 5 months. And so it's not permanent and it can't be extended. So I think it's leading towards relief. Obviously, a big tax like this will be an economic depressant. It will force companies to decide to pass on those costs. And this is all heading into the midterms. The other thing to remember about these tariffs is they're regressive. And so they fall heaviest on the most vulnerable in our society. I don't think that's right. And I think that voters will be unhappy with this.
When we get to those refund checks, it's going to go to lower courts now. Do you have any inkling about how much you might get back and what the timeline might be?
Well, no one knows the timeline. We spent a little over $10 million on IEEPA tariffs in 2025, and I don't know, we spent some more this year, but I don't know how much more. And we expect that money returned to us in due course with interest. I think that the hand wringing and the fear mongering on how hard this will be to return the money is a bit of a head fake. The government sends out millions of tax refunds every year with interest. No one opens those envelopes with a sense of marvel at how they were able to do that. And they know exactly what they took from us, when and why and how much. And they can just reverse the gears and send it back to us. It's our money. They took it unlawfully. They have to return it. And I'm not crying for them that they find it inconvenient.
Rick, you seem anything but triumphant here. I want to ask you, does that have something to do with how difficult it has been to run your business in the last year? And also the fact that you didn't really get backup from the corporate titans until late in the game?
The truth is we've never viewed our case as political. And so it's not mano a mano with Mr. Trump. We contested that the law was being misapplied. And so feeling vindicated, feeling that the court respected the way the law was written is the victory, and participating in this process in a historic case is part of the victory. I have declined to comment on choices other people made. We made this choice for ourselves. We're a multi-generational family business. We're in a mission-driven business. We make educational products for schools and homes. And we have hundreds of families who depend on our company for their livelihood. Our motivation was to protect those legacies and to protect those relationships. That's central to our values. And so the decision for us was easy.
In terms of what may not have been easy would have been things like legal fees, and there are probably more to come. Bottom line, will this put you further ahead for your business, for your profits, your margins?
Well, I'd like to say that when things were at their nadir, we were going to be spending many tens of millions of dollars a year for the rest of time immemorial paying these unlawful taxes. So while I suppose it's painful to pay legal fees, I actually think our law firm is amazing and we achieved something very worthwhile. At the end of the day, the burden on our company will go down as a result of what we did. And so I think the money was well spent. And as I said, the lawyers did an amazing job.
It is a truly historic decision, no matter what side of it you came down on. Rick Waldenberg will continue to check in with you. Thank you. U.S. Supreme Court decision striking down most of President Donald Trump's tariffs. Trump said he was ashamed of certain justices after they posted their 6-3 decision. Two of his appointees, in fact, Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, voted with the majority. Gorsuch wrote that while it's tempting to bypass Congress, the deliberative nature of legislating is part of the Constitution. Joan Biskupic joins us now. I mean, Joan, look, you are completely steeped in this court. The president's characterization of the justices, I'm sure you couldn't have even predicted that one. Have struck down, you know, it was stunning, really, the language that he used. This was deeply personal for the president, but I'm wondering, what can you tell us about how these justices would have interpreted this, especially the Chief Justice?
You know, the Chief Justice is aware of the fact that in the U.S., there's really this narrative that the court is always in lockstep with Donald Trump. And, you know, it wasn't here. And maybe Donald Trump just could not handle that. He'd been winning so much over the last couple months. And, you know, he had won this major immunity ruling from the justices back in 2024, which helped him toward his election. And I think what really got him here is, you know, that they ruled against the signature initiative of his, even though he had been warned by people in his own administration that there were better ways to do this. This violates, this is just plain unlawful, the way he tread into Congress's territory here. But, you know, he seemed to be particularly upset that two of his appointees, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, were in the majority. And Paula, when he made that remark about not just being ashamed for them, but embarrassed for their families, that takes his criticism out of the realm of, you know, the substantive nature of the decision into, you know, security issues. He has, in the past, unleashed his vitriol toward lower court judges who've been then targeted in various ways by members of the public. And to do this for the Supreme Court was, as you say, just so unprecedented and so unnecessary. You know, he has other ways to impose tariffs, and he has other initiatives before this Supreme Court, many of which he will probably win, just as he has won considerable latitude from the justices since he first took office in January of 2025. So it was an amazing response. And one other thing I will mention, it stood in such contrast to the scene in the courtroom where I was today when John Roberts read excerpts of his opinion in this kind of steady, measured way, trying to suggest by the way he was approaching it that this is not some huge clash between the judiciary and the executive branch, that this is actually a very straightforward decision. And it was. Precedent is on the side of the ruling here. Donald Trump exceeded his bounds of trying to go it alone on tariffs. He can impose tariffs. It's just that he needs the cooperation of Congress, and he needs to take certain steps that can be time-consuming that he just did not want to do here.
Joan, grateful to you. Story now, the Supreme Court has struck down many of President Trump's tariffs. The decision only applies to duties he imposed using emergency powers. Sectors like the movie industry still remain vulnerable to targeted tariffs. Trump said last month that he still wants to put tariffs on films made outside of the United States. Tim Richards is CEO of View, one of Europe's largest cinema operators. Good to see you, especially when we have breaking news on a day like today. Look, a lot to get to with you, but starting with the uncertainty that even this kind of ruling, but also that President Trump continues to put in front of negotiations. You know as well as I do, he's going to use all the political and economic power he can to elicit what he wants from the UK and Europe. Do you feel that this is another level uncertainty that could hurt your industry?
No, I mean, I think we've certainly have heard this before. And I think certainly when it's a very easy soundbite to put tariffs on our industry, the details are a lot more challenging to try and decide, you know, what is a movie, what is an American movie, what is a foreign film movie, because so many movies now, in fact, most movies are shot on so many different locations. And, you know, is it the script? Is it where it was actually shot? It was the financing behind it, the director, the cast. it's virtually impossible. So that's not something that keeps me up at night right now.
A lot of other things do, though.
Let's begin with President Donald Trump as he attempts to find a way around the Supreme Court's decision to strike down his sweeping emergency tariffs. He's now slapping a 10% levy on all countries. But these tariffs, they can only stay in place for 150 days, and that is unless Congress extends them. The president calling 6 of those Supreme Court justices a disgrace to the nation. And this after they ruled that his use of emergency powers was unconstitutional. Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, both Trump appointees, joined with Chief Justice John Roberts and the 3 liberal justices in the majority. A decision is now a massive blow to President Trump's foreign policy and his economic agenda.
They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution.
Mr. President, on the Supreme Court justices who ruled against this the policy, striking it down, are they still invited to your State of the Union next week? And will you speak with them?
They are invited, barely. Barely. 3 are happily invited. No, they're barely invited. Honestly, I couldn't care less if they come, okay?
And what followed was, take a look here, some fairly modest reaction in the markets with the ruling boosting U.S. stocks on Friday, but also rising gold prices. And that signals that traders are also weighing potential uncertainty over future tariffs. Let's begin our coverage with CNN's Kristen Holmes, who's got more from the White House.
President Trump on Friday night announcing on Truth Social he had signed a 10% global tariff. Now, this, of course, came after the Supreme Court had ruled that his tariffs were illegal and after we saw President Trump giving a press conference in which he essentially berated the Supreme Court. It was very clear that he took this incredibly personally. He also singled out those justices that he had appointed to the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch. This is what he had to say about the decision and those justices.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
Now, it didn't stop there. At one point, he was asked if he regretted appointing those 2 justices to the Supreme Court. He wouldn't answer that, but said that this was an embarrassment to their families, getting incredibly personal here. Now, of course, we should note that these tariffs are not just a critical part of President Trump's economic agenda, but he's also been using them as leverage in almost all of his foreign policy and these meetings with foreign leaders, something that he clearly took incredibly personal that they ruled against him. Now, we, of course, know that they are going to work around this. One of the biggest questions now, of course, is what happens to that money that had already been collected. The Supreme Court didn't mention that. President Trump believes it's going to be tied up in litigation for roughly 2 years. I've talked to a number of Trump advisors who say, well, the court has made this ruling. They're now going to have to step in and fix this because there is a belief that a lot of these corporations are going to try to litigate this to get refunds back on some of these tariffs. Another question is what happens to the money that has already been used. We know, again, they've been using this revenue for quite a few endeavors. If President Trump's list is accurate, still a lot of questions as to what exactly this ruling means. Kristen Holmes, CNN, the White House.
And the court decision, it applies mainly to what the Trump administration calls reciprocal tariffs. Those were announced with great fanfare last April. You remember it was touted as Liberation Day by the White House. And it impacted nearly every country in the world. The president has used laws on national security to slap duties on goods like steel, aluminum, cars, even kitchen cabinets. Those remain in effect. So do tariffs on countries like China that were investigated and found to engage in unfair trade by the Trump administration. Let's bring in now CNN's Will Ripley joining me live from Taipei. Will, it's great to see you. Obviously, these are just enormous implications that come with this ruling. You have the political, you have the legal. Let's touch on the economic, especially for what this means regionally there in Asia. I mean, what are trading partners where you are saying about this decision from the Supreme Court?
Well, I think the general consensus is that uncertainty is the name of the game when it comes to dealing with the United States, and particularly the Trump administration. And so when you have trading partners and allies like Japan, like South Korea, that have pledged to invest huge amounts of money into the United States to try to minimize the impact of tariffs. And they've negotiated trade deals with the United States, here in Taiwan, of course, as well. You have governments cautiously saying that they will be reviewing this ruling and taking a very close look at next steps. A little more of snark, if you will, coming from other countries, both here in the region and around the world, like New Zealand. They're saying that any relief from tariff is welcome, but of course they're saying the uncertainty remains. The EU, there's a lawmaker there saying this is a victory for the rule of law, but they're still actually reviewing what the impact's going to be. The UK saying that they expect their favorable trade ties, their privileged trading relationship with the US to continue. Business groups say it's still unclear what exactly is going to change here, particularly because there are other tariffs that are in place under different laws. Now, here in Taiwan, where semiconductor trade is crucial between the United States and this self-governing democracy. In fact, Taiwan exports to the U.S. are now higher than China. So they're obviously watching this very closely, saying that a new 10% tariff would have limited impact. President Trump actually talked about Taiwan in that press conference from the White House. Listen.
Supreme Court did not explain what would happen to the billions of dollars that has already been collected through President Trump's reciprocal tariffs. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, believes the administration should immediately issue refund checks with interest. He says, quote, Donald Trump has been illegally taxing your groceries, furniture, and cars for over a year. Joining us now is the Attorney General of California, Rob Bonta, live in San Francisco. Mr. Attorney General, welcome back to The Story Is.
Good evening, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Governor Newsom says he wants the money back. How does that work? Is that for the state? Is that for consumers? How's that go?
First, I agree with him. You know, the Trump administration, as determined by the U.S. Supreme Court today in their opinion, has indicated that Trump's tariffs that he imposed against essentially every one of our trade partners were unlawful. And importers had to foot the bill, businesses, U.S. businesses. And so they've had to pay tariffs that were unlawful. They've had to give that money, and the federal government has held that money for weeks and months. So they deserve their money back with interest. How do they get it? Well, generally, there's a Court of International Trade process where they can bring a refund action and show how much they paid, show the bills, show the payments, show the payments that they've made with respect to the unlawful tariffs, and get a refund.
Do you think that's going to work? And if it doesn't, are there actions you're willing to take to make sure that happens?
I mean, it's because so many importers, American businesses were harmed and hurt. There's going to be a high volume of claimants who, the number of victims victimized by Trump's unlawful tariffs are enormous. So that can slow down the process. I think there is a role to play for Congress to efficiently and expeditiously move the refunds back into the pockets of business people. The money is sitting there in different pots of funds that Trump likes to talk about. It's illegally gotten, and he needs to give it back to the American businesses that he's taking it from.
So you were in the Supreme Court for the tariffs hearing. You watched all this happen. You were with us on the show after that. You thought that this would be the way that this went based off of the hearing. Yeah. And yet President Trump seemed really surprised with his press conference today and was very upset with the court. What did you make of that whole thing and the way that he lashed out?
He definitely lashed out. It seemed like he was having a temper tantrum of some type, not very becoming of the president of the United States. He must be in denial. I think maybe everyone but him saw this coming. If you were in the courtroom, if you follow the arguments, if you follow the law, you follow the facts, if you saw the questions from the bench of the justices, if you saw his Solicitor General perform in the oral argument, you knew this was coming. This is exactly what I expected. Like exactly. The opinion tracks our arguments that California made with our first state in the nation case that we brought last April. And the alignment of the justices, the 6 justices that were part of the majority, are the exact 6 I thought it would be, based on their questions, based on their statements. So anyone who didn't see this coming in this way has their head in the sand or is in some sort of denial. It's unfortunate that he went on, Trump, to attack the justices that were part of the majority. They did exactly what they're supposed to do. Follow the facts, follow the law, let the chips fall where they may, even if it means that a president's tariff policy, what he said was his centerpiece economic policy, is struck down. If it's unlawful, it should be struck down. And it wasn't even close here. It was clearly unlawful. And the U.S. Supreme Court found that.
Does today and the way that the conservative Republicans, at least some of them on the court, acted, does that make you feel better about our system, about checks and balances, about American democracy?
You know, call me hardwired hopeful. I always thought it was going to be this way, that if you have the facts presented to you, if you apply the law as it exists, then they will find for us most of the time. And they have. The courts generally, 80% of the time. The U.S. Supreme Court, when we have fully briefed arguments in front of them, where there's briefing and amicus and an argument and back and forth from the bench, we've won on major cases. We won on National Guard. We won on Prop 50. Those didn't have the full briefings I just mentioned, but they did have really substantive engagement. And we won on tariffs. You know, this is a centerpiece policy, but it goes to the point that no one is above the law and everyone must follow it. And if you break the law, those actions will be struck down. And that's what happened here. And I was grateful to see 3 justices on the conservative side of the bench, Roberts and Gorsuch and Barrett, all be part of the majority opinion.
Opting for Plan B and finding other ways to impose tariffs after the Supreme Court ruled his use of emergency powers is unconstitutional. He is now slapping a new 10% tariff on all countries under a trade law known as Section 122. But these tariffs can only be in place for 150 days. That's unless Congress extends them. The president is lashing out at the justices who ruled against his tariffs, calling them a disgrace to our nation. Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, who were appointed by President Trump, joined with Chief Justice John Roberts and the 3 liberal justices in the 6-3 ruling. The decision is a massive blow to President Trump's foreign policy and economic agenda.
They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution.
Mr. President, the Supreme Court justices who ruled against this the policy, striking it down, are they still invited to your State of the Union next week? And will you speak with them?
They are invited, barely. Barely. 3 are happily invited. No, they're barely invited. Honestly, I couldn't care less if they come, okay?
CNN's Kristen Holmes was in that press conference in the front row, and she has more now from the White House.
President Trump on Friday night announcing on Truth Social he had signed a 10% global tariff. Now, this, of course, came after the Supreme Court had ruled that his tariffs were illegal and after we saw President Trump giving a press conference in which he essentially berated the Supreme Court. It was very clear that he took this incredibly personally. He also singled out those justices that he had appointed to the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch. This is what he had to say about the decision and those justices.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
Now, it didn't stop there. At one point, he was asked if he regretted appointing those 2 justices to the Supreme Court. He wouldn't answer that, but said that this was an embarrassment to their families, getting incredibly personal here. Now, of course, we should note that these tariffs are not just a critical part of President Trump's economic agenda, but he's also been using them.
Hours after the Supreme Court delivered a major blow to the administration. 6-3 ruling here, the court decided the president's sweeping tariffs are illegal. 2 of the president's own picks for the court ruled against him. And now the question is, what happens to the more than $130 billion collected from tariffs? Some lawmakers say it needs to go back to consumers.
And what the Trump administration should have been doing over the past several months, knowing that this opinion was coming, is start putting in place a way to refund the money directly to the American families who've paid for it.
Well, President Trump has not said anything about what will happen to that money, but he's already retaliating against the ruling. CNN's Kristen Holmes has more. Kristen?
Victor, on Friday night, President Trump announcing on Truth Social that he had signed a 10% global tariff. Now, of course, this came after a press conference he gave where he railed against the Supreme Court and particularly the justices who had ruled against him. Of course, one thing to note is that two of those justices were handpicked by him, Justice Amy Coney Barrett as well as Neil Gorsuch. Here's what he had to say.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
Now, it was clear during this press conference that he was growing more and more angry. He was taking this incredibly personally. It seemed as though he believed, because he had appointed these justices in particular, that they should have ruled in his favor. And the other part to point out here is just how critical these tariffs are to President Trump's agenda, not just his economic agenda, which, of course, they serve as a center of. He has been using the revenue. He has touted the revenue from these tariffs. In fact, they were counting on some of the revenue to pay off a hefty portion of these giant tax cuts that he signed into law as part of the big, beautiful bill. But in addition to that, it's really been a source of power for President Trump on the international stage. He has used them as leverage in almost every foreign policy meeting that he has had with various leaders. So it's unclear how that's going to play out now. But, of course, we reported that there are other avenues. He said he's already going to impose these tariffs as well as look into other ways to utilize various different trade laws, something we'll be keeping an eye on very closely. But again, he views this as a real betrayal. At one point, he said that those justices that he had appointed were an embarrassment to their family and got incredibly personal. Victor?
Kristen Holmes at the White House, thank you. We're also hearing from world leaders in the wake of that Supreme Court ruling. French President Emmanuel Macron is praising the decision as good for democracy.
First, I think this invites everyone to reflect. It doesn't seem bad to have Supreme Courts and therefore a rule of law. For those who think Supreme Courts create problems in political life, Supreme Court looked at the Constitution and said, this is not in line with the Constitution. Now everyone says this is great. There you go. It's good to have checks and balances in democracies.
Also new this morning, South Korean officials are meeting today after President Trump immediately slapped new 10% global tariffs. The foreign minister said the South Korean government will review the ruling and work on future response plans. Trump announced the new tariffs after the Supreme Court ruled that his emergency-based tariffs were illegal. Let's go to CNN senior international correspondent Will Ripley now. Will, good morning.
Hey, Victor. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned South Korea. They, along with Japan, have pledged to invest tens of billions of dollars into the United States. Here in Taiwan as well, you're talking about over $100 billion in investments to try to avoid these escalated tariffs that the Supreme Court has said, at least in some instances, are illegal. So now there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen next. Is any of the money going to be reimbursed? What is this going to mean for future negotiations with the Trump administration, which has essentially been a year and 1 month so far, Trump 2.0 of this chaos and uncertainty when it comes to foreign policy, particularly trade. So when you have voices like Macron in France and voices in the EU at large saying that this is a victory for rule of law, certainly they're trying to be pointed in their response, and yet they still have to figure out exactly how they're going to deal with the United States. The UK saying, for example, they're expecting their trade ties to continue, a strong trade relationship between the US and the UK, but business groups there say they're not sure what's going to happen now. Same thing in South Korea, where they're going to be reviewing and assessing next steps from here. New Zealand saying that any relief from tariffs would be welcome, but all of this uncertainty remains. And then, of course, here in Taiwan, where they worked very hard as sort of an underdog to try to negotiate a trade deal with the United States, where they are now celebrating a huge increase in trade between the U.S. and Taiwan, actually Taiwan surpassing China at the end of last year in terms of export numbers, meaning that there's been such a steep drop in imports from China and such a surge in exports from Taiwan that Taiwan's actually now selling more to China, more to the United States than it does to both China and Hong Kong. President Trump talked about Taiwan, actually, in his press conference at the White House. He mentioned it as a success story when it comes to his tariffs. Listen.
Taiwan came in. They stole our chip business. Now all those companies in Taiwan are building factories in Arizona, Texas, and various other places because they don't want to pay tariffs. They're all pouring into the United States.
Taiwan would argue that they didn't steal the chip industry, but they spent decades building a chip manufacturing ecosystem that continues to send huge amounts of advanced chips, not just to the United States, but really vital for tech around the world. I think the bottom line, though, Victor, is that nations globally that have all been impacted by these tariffs now are looking at the rules possibly changing again. Existing trade deals are now in question, and this just global uncertainty continues. Uncertainty and chaos have been two of the key words during this first year and 1 month of Trump 2.0, Victor.
Trying to weigh their options after President Trump's so-called Liberation Day tariffs were ruled unconstitutional. Now, the president, he did not hold back. He lashed out at the entrepreneur who sued him over his tariff policy.
I know the people that brought the lawsuit, and, you know, they're sleazebags, major sleazebags. We got sued by sleazebags, I know them well, that are very outside country, China-centric, but outside country-centric. And they're going to end up not doing as well as they did before.
Joining me now is the man who sued Trump and won, Rick Waldenberg. He's the CEO of Learning Resources. Rick, thanks for joining me this morning. I know it's been a busy 18 hours or so since the ruling. I'm going to ask for two reactions because I saw you in the preview monitor react silently to what the president said about you. Let me start there. Any words in response to how the president described you personally?
Well, I'm not usually called a sleazebag. We make educational products for schools and homes. Not very controversial, and I don't think a lot of people think we're sleazebags.
All right. Second reaction to the Supreme Court ruling.
Well, obviously, really gratified. You know, when Liberation Day came along, the future of our family business was threatened significantly. We've been a family business for over 100 years, and we're also a mission-driven business. We're trying to give kids a great start in life. That plus the relationship with our employees and their families who depend on us was a threat to our existence. And so we had to pursue this and to have the court stand with us that in our contention that it was an unlawful tax, and to also to reinforce the rule of law meant a lot to us. We're proud of this.
And so, as you know, the Supreme Court offered no remedy to return the money, or even said that the administration must do it. What will be your first step to try to recover the money you spent?
I think the case has been remanded to the Court of International Trade, who very often oversees this kind of the resolution of this kind of dispute. Also, the federal government has made numerous filings in our case and other cases indicating that if the tariffs were declared unlawful, they would return them. So the fear-mongering, the hand-wringing about how difficult this is, it's hard to take seriously. They're very good at taking the money. I think they should just reverse the gears and give it back, and I expect that's what's going to happen.
How much did you spend additionally because of these tariffs?
Well, when we finally toted it up for 2025, we'd spent over $10 million plus additional monies on the expenses of moving our supply chain, and that's putting aside the cost of litigation. And we've spent more in 26. I don't have that number. So it's a very substantial sum. We borrowed it from the bank, and we'd like the money back. But you know, we danced between the raindrops, and we finished the year in a healthy condition, and we're ready to start growing again. We've got to get out of this cycle of being reactive and run our business.
Did you have to raise your prices because of the tariffs?
For sure we did. Our marginal tax rate last year was over 100% between federal, state, and IEPA taxes. You can't run a business where make a dollar, spend more than a dollar in taxes. That has a very sad ending. And we can't do any good for people if we get sick. So we had a modest mid-single digits price increase last year, but we also strongly believed we would win this case, which we did. So we elected not to raise our prices for 26. And so we're trying to give the money back by averaging our price down. And I would hope that by the end of next year, our prices will be where they would have been but for the tariffs.
Okay, so
we're trying to navigate back to something fair and reasonable as quickly as we can.
So you're trying to return your prices back to where they were or at least mitigate the increase now that the tariffs have ended. Let me ask you this question. If the 10 million, and you say 10 million just in tariffs, if that's returned to you, do you return any of that to the customer who paid the increase based on the tariff?
Some customers actually reimbursed us for tariffs. So, of course, they'll get their money back with the same interest that we collect from the government. But it's very difficult to assign us the task of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again when the government shoved them off the top of the wall. So I'm not sure how we do that. The approach that we've taken when considering this equitable question is to return our prices as quickly as we can to where they would have been. Remember, we're in an inflationary environment too.
Sure.
So costs rise every year. So we're trying to average it down. And I think that will be welcome with our customers.
Rick Waldenberg, I appreciate the conversation. Thanks so much. All right, still ahead, America is...
Let's begin with President Donald Trump as he attempts to find a way around the Supreme Court's decision to strike down his sweeping emergency tariffs. He's now slapping a 10% levy on all countries. But these tariffs, they can only stay in place for 150 days, and that is unless Congress extends them. The president calling 6 of those Supreme Court justices a disgrace to the nation. And this after they ruled that his use of emergency powers was unconstitutional. Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, both Trump appointees, joined with Chief Justice John Roberts and the 3 liberal justices in the majority. A decision is now a massive blow to President Trump's foreign policy and his economic agenda.
They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution.
Mr. President, the Supreme Court justices who ruled against this the policy, striking it down, are they still invited to your State of the Union next week? And will you speak with them?
They are invited, barely. Barely. 3 are happily invited. No, they're barely invited. Honestly, I couldn't care less if they come, okay?
And what followed was, take a look here, some fairly modest reaction in the markets with the ruling boosting U.S. stocks on Friday, but also rising gold prices. And that signals that traders are also weighing potential uncertainty over future tariffs. Let's begin our coverage with CNN's Kristen Holmes, who's got more from the White House.
President Trump on Friday night announcing on Truth Social he had signed a 10% global tariff. Now, this, of course, came after the Supreme Court had ruled that his tariffs were illegal and after we saw President Trump giving a press conference in which he essentially berated the Supreme Court. It was very clear that he took this incredibly personally. He also singled out those justices that he had appointed to the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch. This is what he had to say about the decision and those justices.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
Now, it didn't stop there. At one point, he was asked if he regretted appointing those 2 justices to the Supreme Court. He wouldn't answer that, but said that this was an embarrassment to their families, getting incredibly personal here. Now, of course, we should note that these tariffs are not just a critical part of President Trump's economic agenda, but he's also been using them as leverage in almost all of his foreign policy and these meetings with foreign leaders, something that he clearly took incredibly personal that they ruled against him. Now, we, of course, know that they are going to work around this. One of the biggest questions now, of course, is what happens to that money that had already been collected. The Supreme Court didn't mention that. President Trump believes it's going to be tied up in litigation for roughly 2 years. I've talked to a number of Trump advisors who say, well, the court has made this ruling. They're now going to have to step in and fix this because there is a belief that a lot of these corporations are going to try to litigate this to get refunds back on some of these tariffs. Another question is what happens to the money that has already been used. We know, again, they've been using this revenue for quite a few endeavors. If President Trump's list is accurate, still a lot of questions as to what exactly this ruling means. Kristen Holmes, CNN, the White House.
And the court decision, it applies mainly to what the Trump administration calls reciprocal tariffs. Those were announced with great fanfare last April. You remember it was touted as Liberation Day by the White House, and it impacted nearly every country in the world. The president has used laws on national security to slap duties on goods like steel, aluminum, cars, even kitchen cabinets. Those remain in effect. So do tariffs on countries like China that were investigated and found to engage in unfair trade by the Trump administration. Let's bring in now CNN's Will Ripley joining me live from Taipei. Will, it's great to see you. Obviously, these are just enormous implications that come with this ruling. You have the political, you have the legal. Let's touch on the economic, especially for what this means regionally there in Asia. I mean, what are trading partners where you are saying about this decision from the Supreme Court?
Well, I think the general consensus is that uncertainty is the name of the game when it comes to dealing with the United States, and particularly the Trump administration. And so when you have trading partners and allies like Japan, like South Korea, that have pledged to invest huge amounts of money into the United States to try to minimize the impact of tariffs, and they've negotiated trade deals with the United States, here in Taiwan, of course, as well. You have governments cautiously saying that they will be reviewing this ruling and taking a very close look at next steps. A little more of snark, if you will, coming from other countries, both here in the region and around the world, like New Zealand. They're saying that any relief from tariff is welcome, but of course they're saying the uncertainty remains. The EU, there's a lawmaker there saying this is a victory for the rule of law, but they're still actually reviewing what the impact's going to be. The UK saying that they expect their favorable trade ties, their privileged trading relationship with the U.S. to continue. Business groups say it's still unclear what exactly is going to change here, particularly because there are other tariffs that are in place under different laws. Now, here in Taiwan, where semiconductor trade is crucial between the United States and this self-governing democracy, in fact, Taiwan exports to the U.S. are now higher than China. So they're obviously watching this very closely, saying that a new 10% tariff would have limited impact. President Trump actually talked about Taiwan in that press conference from the White House. Listen.
Supreme Court did not explain what would happen to the billions of dollars that has already been collected through President Trump's reciprocal tariffs. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, believes the administration should immediately issue refund checks with interest. He says, quote, Donald Trump has been illegally taxing your groceries, furniture, and cars for over a year. Joining us now is the Attorney General of California, Rob Bonta, live in San Francisco. Mr. Attorney General, welcome back to The Story Is.
Good evening, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Governor Newsom says he wants the money back. How does that work? Is that for the state? Is that for consumers? How's that go?
First, I agree with him. You know, the Trump administration, as determined by the U.S. Supreme Court today in their opinion, has indicated that Trump's tariffs that he imposed against essentially every one of our trade partners were unlawful. And importers had to foot the bill, businesses, U.S. businesses. And so they've had to pay tariffs that were unlawful. They've had to give that money, and the federal government has held that money for weeks and months. So they deserve their money back with interest. How do they get it? Well, generally, there's a Court of International Trade process where they can bring a refund action and show how much they paid, show the bills, show the payments, show the payments that they've made with respect to the unlawful tariffs, and get a refund.
Do you think that's going to work? And if it doesn't, are there actions you're willing to take to make sure that happens?
I mean, it's because so many importers, American businesses were harmed and hurt. There's going to be a high volume of claimants who, the number of victims victimized by Trump's unlawful tariffs are enormous. So that can slow down the process. I think there is a role to play for Congress to efficiently and expeditiously move the refunds back into the pockets of business people. The money is sitting there in different pots of funds that Trump likes to talk about. It's illegally gotten, and he needs to give it back to the American businesses that he's taking it from.
So you were in the Supreme Court for the tariffs hearing. You watched all this happen. You were with us on the show after that. You thought that this would be the way that this went based off of the hearing. Yeah. And yet President Trump seemed really surprised with his press conference today and was very upset with the court. What did you make of that whole thing and the way that he lashed out?
He definitely lashed out. It seemed like he was having a temper tantrum of some type, not very becoming of the president of the United States. He must be in denial. I think maybe everyone but him saw this coming. If you were in the courtroom, if you follow the arguments, if you follow the law, you follow the facts, if you saw the questions from the bench of the justices, if you saw his Solicitor General perform in the oral argument, you knew this was coming. This is exactly what I expected. Like exactly, the opinion tracks our arguments that California made with our first state in the nation case that we brought last April. And the alignment of the justices, the 6 justices that were part of the majority, are the exact 6 I thought it would be, based on their questions, based on their statements. So anyone who didn't see this coming in this way has their head in the sand or is in some sort of denial. It's unfortunate that he went on, Trump, to attack the justices that were part of the majority. They did exactly what they're supposed to do. Follow the facts, follow the law, let the chips fall where they may, even if it means that a president's tariff policy, what he said was his centerpiece economic policy, is struck down. If it's unlawful, it should be struck down. And it wasn't even close here. It was clearly unlawful. And the U.S. Supreme Court found that.
Does today and the way that the conservative Republicans, at least some of them on the court, acted, does that make you feel better about our system, about checks and balances, about American democracy?
Call me hardwired hopeful. I always thought it was going to be this way, that if you have the facts presented to you, if you apply the law as it exists, then they will find for us most of the time. And they have. The courts generally, 80% of the time. The U.S. Supreme Court, when we have fully briefed arguments in front of them, where there's briefing and amicus and an argument and back and forth from the bench, we've won on major cases. We won on National Guard. We won on Prop 50. Those didn't have the full briefings I just mentioned, but they did have really substantive engagement. And we won on tariffs. This is a centerpiece policy, but it goes to the point that no one is above the law and everyone must follow it. And if you break the law, those actions will be struck down. And that's what happened here. And I was grateful to see 3 justices on the conservative side of the bench, Roberts and Gorsuch and Barrett, all be part of the majority opinion.
Opting for Plan B and finding other ways to impose tariffs after the Supreme Court ruled his use of emergency powers is unconstitutional. He is now slapping a new 10% tariff on all countries under a trade law known as Section 122. But these tariffs can only be in place for 150 days. That's unless Congress extends them. The president is lashing out at the justices who ruled against his tariffs, calling them a disgrace to our nation. Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, who were appointed by President Trump, joined with Chief Justice John Roberts and the 3 liberal justices in the 6-3 ruling. The decision is a massive blow to President Trump's foreign policy and economic agenda.
They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution.
Mr. President, the Supreme Court justices who ruled against this the policy, striking it down, are they still invited to your State of the Union next week? And will you speak with them?
They are invited, barely. Barely. 3 are happily invited. No, they're barely invited. Honestly, I couldn't care less if they come, okay?
CNN's Kristen Holmes was in that press conference in the front row, and she has more now from the White House.
President Trump on Friday night announcing on Truth Social he had signed a 10% global tariff. Now, this, of course, came after the Supreme Court had ruled that his tariffs were illegal and after we saw President Trump giving a press conference in which he essentially berated the Supreme Court. It was very clear that he took this incredibly personally. He also singled out those justices that he had appointed to the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch. This is what he had to say about the decision and those justices.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
Now, it didn't stop there. At one point, he was asked if he regretted appointing those two justices to the Supreme Court. He wouldn't answer that, but said that this was an embarrassment to their families, getting incredibly personal here. Now, of course, we should note that these tariffs are not just a critical part of President Trump's economic agenda, but he's also been using them as leverage in almost all of his foreign policy and these meetings with foreign leaders, something that he clearly took incredibly personal that they ruled against him. Now, we, of course, know that they are going to work around this. One of the biggest questions now, of course, is what happens to that money that had already been collected. The Supreme Court didn't mention that. President Trump believes it's going to be tied up in litigation for roughly 2 years. I've talked to a number of Trump advisors who say, well, the court has made this ruling. They're now going to have to step in and fix this because there is a belief that a lot of these corporations are going to try to litigate this to get refunds back on some of these tariffs. Another question is what happens to the money that has already been used. We know, again, they've been using this revenue for quite a few endeavors. If President Trump's list is accurate, still a lot of questions as to what exactly this ruling means. Kristen Holmes, CNN, the White House.
Thank you, Kristen. Earlier, I spoke with Gene Soroka, the executive director of the Port of L.A., which is the busiest port in the U.S. About 40% of all goods come in through the Port of L.A. and Long Beach. I asked him how the average person might be impacted by all of this.
Probably little change, but if we continue down this path, the tariffs that were announced today, the Section 122 of the Trade Act, are only temporary. By law, they're allowed to be in place for 150 days. So that means yet another wave of decisions and investigations could take place, and likely additional tariffs go in that may be even higher. Now, we've seen over the past year, Alex, that realistically coffee and bananas are up 10% compared to where they were 12 months ago. Same with footwear and furniture. So these additional taxes on American imports lead to higher prices for you and me.
Lynn Vavreck is a professor of American politics at UCLA. Michael Genovese is president of the Global Policy Institute at Loyola Marymount and author of this book, Art, Power, and Politics, Political Storytelling in Paintings, Music, and Movies. Welcome, both of you. Congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Let's start with you as the most recent published author, although you've got 150 other books. And this idea of the tariffs. President Trump very upset today in a press conference, calling out the justices that he appointed. What was your reading on the impact of the tariffs and the politics of it?
Well, it was a major smackdown against the president, and he should not have been surprised because his people should have told him that on the merits of the argument, they were going to lose. Most people, most lawyers and most people who were examining it thought they didn't have a leg to stand on. And so what the court basically said is, you still have a lot of authority in terms of tariffs, but you need to go through Congress, you need to get congressional approval. And so it was really a victory for constitutionalism and a defeat for Donald Trump. He's going to have a lot of authority. He'll be able to make a lot of movement on tariffs, but he still will be limited by the Congress and what the Congress is willing to give him.
How'd you read this?
Well, one of the things that struck me is that this feels unusual. What an odd day where the president is getting sort of sat down. But if you think historically, the Constitution gives presidents very little power. And the struggle to take power wherever they can take it, that's as old as the Constitution. And so in a lot of ways, this isn't that different. But you know, George H.W. Bush has one of my favorite lines on this. He said he was a fighter pilot in the Navy, and when he became president, he said, boy, the glory of being a fighter pilot has really worn off. Presidents don't have a lot of constitutional power. And so Trump, that's why he's taking power all the time. And other presidents have done the same thing. So in a lot of ways, this is just ever so.
But other presidents have been stopped more often than Donald Trump has been stopped, especially during this term, right?
Well, this is sort of how he operates. Act. And I think it's what people who like him, they like this about him. Be bold, do something, try to solve the problem.
Forgiveness, not permission. Not even forgiveness.
Exactly. Yeah, forgiveness, right?
Yeah, right.
Just always in motion, always doing something. And so today's a great example of that too. We did the tariffs trying to solve these problems, and okay, can't do that. We're going to do them another way. We know we're not going to be able to do it like that forever.
Yeah.
But we're doing something to solve your problems.
Well, do you think historically almost every president has been frustrated with the courts at some point? Think about FDR, right, who was trying to do so much, and then his answer potentially was to pack the courts and all of that. But you say Congress now, that the ball maybe is in Congress's court, which is how the Constitution designed this whole system in the first place. Is there an appetite in Congress to actually do these tariffs?
Well, there was at one time an appetite in Congress to defend its authority and defend its power. That has dissipated in the last several decades, primarily because instead of a separation of powers, we now have a separation of parties. And when the party in Congress and the president are the same, there's a mutual agreement to support one another. When constitutionally Madison set up a system of ambition countering ambition, that has been blown out of the water by parties. And so Congress probably would give Donald Trump almost everything he asked for. He hasn't been asking. He's simply been imposing his will. And he's gone way too far. And Congress, even some members of the Republican Party now are going, let's back this up a notch or two.
How does the tariffs play politically? Lynn, you're the poll queen. You look at the way these things impact people in terms of impacting their real lives.
Well, the number one thing, and everybody knows this, feels it, and has heard it a lot, people cannot afford to live their daily lives. On top, so we know that. On top of that are these tariffs that, people understand as a tax. Somehow I'm paying for that. So I think people do feel that way. They're not fans of the tariffs. Now, there are a lot of people out there saying, give the money back, give the money back. And that's obviously complicated. But I would say, do not count out the possibility that with the midterms coming, that Trump is going to say, okay, I'm going to send checks to people. He has done this in the past. Big old signature on the bottom of that check.
With a Sharpie.
With a Sharpie.
Donald Trump.
And right in time for the midterms, look what we've done for you, more money in your pocket. I wouldn't count that out.
And ruled that his sweeping emergency tariffs are illegal and not an emergency. The rare and stinging loss for the president at the High Court is a major victory, actually, for my next source. He argued this very case against the president's tariffs in front of these justices and won. Neil Katyal is the plaintiff's lead attorney, the former acting solicitor general, and who has argued more than 50 cases before the Supreme Court. Neil, I think a big question people have is, where does this one rank for you?
Well, I don't think, Caitlin, first of all, thank you for having me on. I don't think this is about me or my victory. I think it's a victory for the Constitution, for our founders' vision of what America is, which is to recognize that sometimes our leaders are going to be overly ambitious, overly aggressive, and the system they designed creates the opportunities for self-correction. And it takes guts. And here we had guts, not by me, but by a group of small businesses that stood up and said, hey, this isn't what America's about. And so they did what a lot of our nation's biggest companies were afraid to do, which is take the president on these sweeping, unprecedented tariffs, and they won. And they won not just in some, partisan decision or something like that by a bunch of Democrats. No, they won in the Supreme Court of the United States, which is, and they won, with two of the President Trump's three appointees to the Supreme Court siding against President Trump. So it was a sweeping victory, not for us, but for the rule of law.
Well, and how did those small businesses feel when this came down today? I mean, obviously everyone had been waiting and waiting to see what the court would decide. When they were looking through this decision, what was their reaction?
Yeah, I mean, gratified and vindicated. And it's hard for these businesses to do this. It's not like they're fancy with a lot of money and extra cash lying around. So this is, it's hard on their families, and yet they stepped up and did the right thing, and they made an incredible difference. And for me, it was just the privilege of a lifetime, as the son of immigrants, to be standing before the Supreme Court, making an argument rooted in our constitutional history, rooted in what Alexander Hamilton and James Madison thought about the way our Constitution is supposed to work. There's no greater honor that I could imagine.
I think you make a good point about how it affected these small businesses on a day-to-day basis to deal with not just the tariffs, but also the uncertainty of them and, how much they changed and they would go up and go down or kind of on the president's whims. I was reading about one small business owner who spent $50,000 in tariffs as they were just building their products. For them tonight, the question about a refund is a real one. You know, it's some $134 billion. What did you make of the fact that the Supreme Court left that unsettled in the ruling today?
So the Supreme Court, Caitlin, gave us everything we asked for. I mean, we made 6 basic arguments in the case. They accepted all of them, not at 90%, but at 100%. With respect to the refunds, our plaintiffs in our case, the government has already conceded will get the refunds. And with respect to everyone else, I think the court did the right thing by saying, look, there's a process. We're going to go back to the lower courts, let that unfold, and didn't, prematurely weigh in on those questions. But the Supreme Court today said this money was wrongfully taken from the American people. And so there's always a remedy for that under the laws of Congress, which is the money comes back to the rightful owner. And so I suspect that money will all come back to the American people as it should.
What stood out to you from the ruling in terms of, was it reading Gorsuch when he was talking about this is the purpose of legislating? Yes, sometimes it's slow and it takes forever, but that's kind of the point, is that you can know what the process is going to look like. You don't have to guess. It's not on a whim every day. Or is there something else in there that really stood out to you?
Yeah, I do think Justice Gorsuch's opinion is one place to look, and it's very similar to an opinion written 70 years ago by Justice Robert Jackson, one of our greatest justices, who wrote, I think, the most important opinion in the 20th century in the steel seizure case. And Jackson made the same very point that Gorsuch made here toward the end of his opinion, which is, look, the Constitution's cumbersome. Sometimes it's slow. Sometimes it's frustrating. But there's a wisdom to what our framers said. And that wisdom requires you to go to Congress and not to have such major decisions made by one person. I ended my brief to the Supreme Court, my written brief, with that quote from Justice Jackson. I ended my oral argument on November 5th with that quote. And I saw Justice Gorsuch today picking up that mantle and bringing it forward. I think it's a really important opinion, one that will be studied for, I suspect, centuries. And so that's one thing I thought was important. And the other I thought was just the lineup. Oftentimes in these high-profile cases, they're 5-4. But this one was 6-3, and notably with 2 of President Trump's 3 appointees voting against him.
Well, the president, he almost came to the arguments, as you know, and then he was talked out of it by some advisors. Today he was saying he tried to be well-behaved ahead of this ruling. I want you to listen to what he told reporters.
I wanted to be very well-behaved because I wanted to do anything. I didn't want to do anything that would affect the decision of the court, because I understand the court. I understand how they are very easily swayed. I want to be a good boy.
Is there anything that you think that he could have done that would have actually swayed them or changed their minds?
Yeah, act in a constitutional way. I mean, not to do this kind of ridiculous, I'm the president, I can do whatever I want type stuff. That it's really hard to win a case against the president in the Supreme Court on a major policy initiative. It maybe has happened once or twice in American history. I mean, it's really tough to do. But we managed to do it today because the president took such an extreme position. And from our perspective, this isn't about partisanship. We had a lot of Republican plaintiffs in our case. We didn't care about that. We just cared about one thing, the Constitution and the presidency being confined to the dictates of the Constitution. And here, what the president did just blew past that so much that we were able to convince the Supreme Court and an overwhelming majority of the court that what the president did was unconstitutional.
Today's extraordinary Supreme Court ruling sparked this extraordinary personal attack on the justices who ruled against President Trump, 2 of whom he nominated.
They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution.
Mr. President, on the Supreme Court justices who ruled against this the policy, striking it down, are they still invited to your State of the Union next week? And will you speak with them?
They are invited, barely. Barely. 3 are happily invited. No, they're barely invited. Honestly, I couldn't care less if they come, okay?
Okay, so we may see the president come face to face with some of these justices on Tuesday. when they take what is typically a front row seat for his State of the Union address here in Washington. Republicans on Capitol Hill have been pretty mum on the president's direct and searing attacks on the justices. But when President Barack Obama criticized a Supreme Court ruling in 2010 during his State of the Union address, he was quickly rebuked by the GOP as they called the moment an outrageous statement, this a breach of decorum, and kind of rude.
With all due deference to separation of powers, last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections.
Could get awkward. I'm joined now by CNN Chief Supreme Court Analyst Joan Biskupic, my political sources, Michael Singleton, Republican strategist, and also the Republican Congressman of California, Kevin Kiley. I'm so glad to have all of you here, but especially you, Joan, because I know you remember that moment well. I don't even know what's going to happen on Tuesday.
Justice Alito has not returned to the State of the Union since that moment because he was caught on camera saying, not true. Oh, he was so angry. Everybody was angry about it. The chief was really mad about that, too.
I mean, so how do you imagine he feels after, I mean, you wrote an entire book on him. How do you imagine he feels after the president saying tonight, well, I'm glad I at least didn't pick him to be on the court?
Well, the scene in the courtroom today was so different from the scene that Donald Trump displayed in front of everyone at the White House. You know, in the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice comes in, and one thing I don't think everybody knows is we do not know what ruling is coming on what day. You know, we've been expecting this one for a while, but the courtroom was pretty empty today. There were lots of seats left in the bar section, in the press section, even in the justice's special seats section. And then the chief takes the bench, and the first thing he says is, I have the decision to announce in Learning Resources versus Trump, the Tariff case. And it was 10 minutes of a steady recitation about how Donald Trump exceeded his authority under the Constitution, exceeded his power under this statute, this emergency power statute, because the power to tax, the power to impose tariffs is squarely that of Congress. And he portrayed it as very clear-cut, tried to not to make Donald Trump his nemesis in any way, just to say these were essentially the facts. That 6-3 margin was actually wider than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be a closer case just by virtue of the fact that the president often has extra power in foreign affairs. But then to see Donald Trump do what we just witnessed, what a contrast, Caitlin.
Well, and we're laughing about the awkward moment, but I mean, you made the great point earlier. A lot of these justices, conservative and the progressive ones, have faced really serious threats and targeted attacks.
And, Donald Trump specifically referred to the families of two of his appointees, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, when he said that they should be embarrassed. So security is a very big issue for them. You know, they can take the criticism generally about their rulings. Probably the justices weren't even watching the TV today. Some of their clerks might have been, but I think they are really troubled by these attacks that inspire members of the public against them.
Yeah, Sir Michael, I was on a plane when this decision came down, so I had time to read all 170 or so pages of it. It's actually really fascinating to look through. But when you do, to Joan's point, John Roberts and the others, they go to make the point of striking down things that President Biden did or other presidents have done where they did not have the authority simply to do it. They talked about the President Biden's student loans attempt.
Yeah.
I mean, they made the point that this isn't just targeted or specific to Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. The Chief Justice did not see Obamacare as a tax, which I, as a conservative, wrote about and argued at the time was an unfair tax. But then he found that this was a tax that the president didn't have the authority to authorize. I'm kind of mixed on this. I'm certainly aware that Congress has the purse. I know that, right? That's just basic governance in our country. But I do think that Justice Thomas made an interesting point in terms of the president's emergency powers not being explicitly and expressly outlined by Congress, therefore him siding against what the majority did in this case. And I think that's his ruling, or his decision rather, was an interesting one. And I think it's one that probably, Joan, could come back up at some point in the future, that being Justice Thomas saying, wait a minute here, Congress, you guys haven't really expressly outlined how far the president can or cannot go as it pertains to these Emergency Powers Acts. So if a president were to try this again, could a president get a court that rules in a different manner? I think that's possible.
Congressman Kiley, I wonder your take on this, because you were one of the 6 House Republicans who ruled against or who voted against the president's tariffs on Canada. He was not happy with that. He didn't go as hard at y'all as he did at the Supreme Court today. But when you listened to what the president said in his response to this, what was your reaction?
Well, I didn't care for it. I mean, it's true there's actually a long history in American politics of politicians sort of attacking the court in one way or another. I actually read a book when I was in law school called American Politicians Confront the Courts. And the idea is it's an easy punching bag because they can't really fight back in any way. But with that being said, criticism has generally been in terms of the actual decisions and the reasoning, as opposed to personal attacks. And so when the governor of my state, Gavin Newsom, has attacked judges in very vicious terms on the Ninth Circuit after decisions he doesn't like dealing with the Second Amendment, I've been very critical of that. And so, I would say the same thing here. I think that if you want to criticize the court and its decisions, that's perfectly fine. That's fair game, but it shouldn't be done in personal terms.
Joan, I mean, just in terms of this moment and what this means, the Supreme Court, despite what you heard from the president today, actually hasn't ruled against him that much, if at all. They've actually ruled in his favor. I wonder what you make of what it says about how they viewed this, and also the other decisions that we know we still have to come, including birthright citizenship and others. They're not as central to his beliefs as tariffs, but still.
Right. Bottom line is that Donald Trump has been winning, and winning by a lot, all the way back to the 2024 decision in which, by a 6-3 vote, the Supreme Court gave him substantial immunity from criminal prosecution.
Which could be part of how he's back in office. I mean,
yes,
he didn't go to trial because of that.
That's exactly right. And they have sided with him on multiple issues that have come up on an emergency basis. Last year, he won a major decision having to do with lower courts trying to block his policies through injunctions. So Donald Trump actually doesn't have much to complain about with this court. Now, obviously, this was a signature economic issue here, but he was pushing the boundaries. And what I think, Caitlin, is that he will lose when he really, really pushes those boundaries. For example, in the birthright citizenship effort that he's doing, he wants to eviscerate a provision of the 14th Amendment that automatically makes anyone who, any baby born here, irrespective of his or her parents and their immigration status, automatically citizens. That is really a dramatic move, unprecedented, along the lines of what he tried to do here with tariffs. When he does that, he's going to lose. But plenty of other things that a more, moderate court might have objected to, he's going to get through, because this is basically a conservative court that believes in expanded presidential power.
Yeah, I mean, and Sharmichael, just to how the president was thinking of coming out today, this was not a press conference they were expecting to happen. He was in the middle of meeting with governors this morning when an aide handed him a piece of paper and he realized that he lost. One of the governors in the room texted me that he called it a disgrace and then left the room to go prepare for this press conference. We were watching today as they were lowering the lights in the briefing room. You can watch this moment as it happened in real time. I mean, obviously, this is a president. He cares about lighting. Yeah. He cares about what that's going to look like when he comes into the room. Obviously, it doesn't normally look like that during the press briefings. But it also shows you this is a big moment for his presidency, and he clearly knew whatever he was about to say was going to be watched by a lot of people.
Look, this was a key point of the president's argument to the American people, levying taxes. One, because the president has long argued, going back 30 plus years ago, that other countries were taking advantage of the United States. Maybe you disagree with that, but that was a central part of his premise when he was on the campaign trail. But also focusing on China, which last year I have strongly supported the president's tariff strategy, because my opinion on this was that we should work with our European allies to really try to cripple China as much as we possibly can, as I personally see them as our greatest adversary. They want to ultimately usurp the United States States and international order. And so in that regard, I thought the president was spot on. He still has a couple different mechanisms, Section 122, which he announced today, 10% tariffs. So I think there's still some authority that the executive maintains to keep moving forward that still benefits the country overall.
Well, on that front, Congressman Kiley, the president said today he doesn't need to go to Congress. Then he put on these 10% tariffs. Obviously, they've only got about 150 days to figure out what comes next. Do you think he needs to come to Congress?
Well, even the president, acknowledges that this authority is ultimately coming from Congress. He's relying on statutes that were passed by previous Congresses. So the question in this case before the court today is whether a particular statute had designated the power to impose tariffs in the context of a declared national emergency. And so now the president will be relying on other statutes, and whether or not he can make use of those will probably depend on the particular context. I mean, there is clearly some statutory authority to impose tariffs in some circumstances. So I think it's something that will have to be examined on a case-by-case basis. But regardless of that, Congress does ultimately have the authority here. And so Congress can, out of its own accord, debate and consider trade policy at any time. And one of the reasons that I voted the way I did last week is I think the time has come, and as Justice Gorsuch explained very well in his concurring opinion, to bring to bear the full capacity and perspectives of the legislature on this really important policy area.
Good news is that there are methods, practices, statutes, and authorities, as recognized by the entire court in this terrible decision, and also as recognized by Congress, which they refer to, that are even stronger than the IEEPA tariffs available to me as President of the United States. But other alternatives will now be used to replace the ones that the court incorrectly rejected. We have alternatives, great alternatives. Could be more money. We'll take in more money, and we'll be a lot stronger for it. We're taking in hundreds of billions of dollars.
That was the president today after the Supreme Court ruled that his sweeping emergency tariffs are illegal. He seems to argue there are bigger and better options out there for imposing tariffs on other countries. My economic source tonight is a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan. Justin Wolfers joins me now. I think that is a question of what options the president does actually have now, because he's announcing this 10% tariff. It's only got a time limit on it, though. What does he actually have before him as his plan B?
I mean, the fundamental question for the president is, what does he want a tariff to achieve? To which question is a tariff the answer? The tariff he's just put in place will last for 150 days. The president's main claim has been he wants to tariff other countries so that he can get leverage over them. Guess what? You can just wait a guy out 150 days. That's not giving you a whole lot of leverage. The president's other claim is that he wants to onshore manufacturing to the United States. No one is going to break ground on a factory in the hope of getting tariffs that run out before you've even managed to get the first bit of concrete poured. So the only thing that this round of tariffs is going to do is raise revenue. It's going to raise revenue from American consumers, and it's going to do so in the lead up to the midterms.
Well, I think the question also, in terms of what you said about leverage, is how other countries see this, because he used it as a pretty effective bargaining tool to get people to the table about a year ago. I mean, do they even honor those agreements now? What does that look like?
Well, actually, I think I disagree with you there, Caitlin. I don't think it was ever an effective bargaining tool. He managed to get people in a room, and he managed to get them to walk outside and give press conferences where he would hold up big charts with bullet points. But I have never, ever seen a signature on an agreement that's come out of the president's meetings. I've seen boasts and bluff, and I bet the same's true for you as well. And then subsequently, having signed these agreements, the president's already breached many of them already. You agree with the Brits on one thing, and then you impose steel tariffs the next day. On and on it goes. So really what we were calling agreements was other countries offering just enough to someone that they understood wasn't going to hold up their end of the deal. That is, they weren't offering very much more than PR. The president's always got the ability to get someone to come to the table. He's the president of the United States, for crying out loud. But what he doesn't have is leverage to get real deals, real access, or real change.
What does this mean for Americans tonight? I mean, are they going to see prices change? Are they going to see any of this? What does that look like, do you think?
Prices aren't going to change in a hurry. With the Supreme Court rules one set of tariffs illegal, one set that potentially had some upside, and then he puts in a different set of temporary tariffs that have no upside whatsoever. That doesn't reduce businesses' costs. This is just season 2 of this soap opera that we've already seen running for, boy, it's been a long year, hasn't it, Caitlin?
Now we're over a year.
No good, very bad day. Trump is fuming tonight after the Supreme Court stood up to him and said it was illegal when he used the emergency powers to slap sweeping tariffs across the globe on his so-called Liberation Day. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion saying in no uncertain terms that emergency powers should not be treated as some kind of cheat code. The decision is a severe loss for Trump, and it throws the future of his signature policy into limbo. And as you can imagine, he didn't take the news well.
To show you how ridiculous the opinion is, however, the court said that I'm not allowed to charge even $1. I can't charge $1. But I am allowed to cut off any and all trade or business with that same country. In other words, I can destroy the trade. I can destroy the country. I'm even allowed to impose a foreign country-destroying embargo. I can embargo. I can do anything I want, but I can't charge $1.
But the president has a backup plan, which he says he signed into as an executive order tonight, and that's going to be to reimpose his tariffs at least for the next 150 days. The big question now is, though, what happens to that $134 billion in tariff money that the government has already raked in? Well, the courts didn't really say what would happen with it, but the battle is just beginning as states and companies and Americans start to demand their refunds. This seems to be an unexpected but pretty clear ruling against the president on a statute that has really never been used the way Trump attempted to use it. Ellie, what do you make of just how clear and I thought simple, frankly, the Roberts ruling was, and the fact that it was 6-3?
So this is a what goes around comes around moment in the law. If you applauded when the Supreme Court struck down Joe Biden's student debt program in 2023, you can't boo this, because the legal theory that was used here is almost exactly the same, which is if Congress is going to delegate some of its power over to the president, which they can do, they have to specifically say what they're authorizing him to do in the law they pass if the president's going to then use it to do something of massive economic or political impact. And the 6-3 ruling, by the way, people hear 6-3, they think, oh, must be the typical 6-3. This was not the typical 6-3. You had Chief Justice Roberts, you had Neil Gorsuch, and you had Amy Coney Barrett joining with the 3 liberals to form the majority. So whatever one thinks, you guys will get to the economics of it and the politics of it. But legally, this is a sound decision according to the precedent that's already been set.
Well, let's get to the economics of it. Because essentially, they're just saying, look, this is not the statute to do what you want to do, and particularly if what you want to do is just random tariffs on every country in the world at whatever number you want it to be. There are other things that you can do. It's just not this.
Yeah, so let's back up 1 second. This is strictly having to do with IEEPA. This does not have to do with a sweeping tariff rebut from the Supreme Court. IEEPA only enables the president to block trade or stop trade with countries. He cannot gain one single dollar from the IEEPA ruling. The other tariffs in place, which are about half of what's in place, has not been touched by the Supreme Court. He has a constitutional right to have those tariffs in place, and he's now going to replace the IEEPA tariffs that were put in place, which, by the way, were put in place mainly with China, Mexico, and Canada in order to secure our borders and stop the flow of fentanyl into the country. This was part of his negotiation. So we're going to take the IEEPA away, which the Supreme Court ruled on today. He's then going to use Section 232, Section 301, Section 122, which, by the way, he already enacted Section 121 tonight with a sweeping 10% tariff, and just replace the IEEPA tariffs. That's really what we need to focus on here. This was not a sweeping rebut of President Trump's tariffs. This was IEEPA only.
I guess I disagree on a host of dimensions. One dimension that seems really, really important is, while it's true that you're already starting to see the president talk about other trade authorities and, in fact, invoke other trade authorities to try to replicate some of these IEEPA tariffs that were struck down this morning, the reality is there is a lot more process that is required to be able to effectuate those other types of trade authorities. existing 10% across the board tariffs that were levied tonight, those are only going to be in place for 150 days and only will stay in place if Congress authorizes them to continue. So this is a really significant ruling, and it's a really significant ruling because from a legal perspective, you had a court who stood up to the president and said the power to tax and the power to spend rests with Congress and Congress alone. I do agree with you from an economic perspective. If you think about what this ruling really means, there have been about $140 billion of IEEPA tariffs that have been levied in the last year. Those tariffs have fallen through to consumers in the form of higher prices. And if and when we see any refunds, and again, the decision isn't clear about exactly what process that would undertake, even if they were to do refunds, those would go to firms and not to the American consumers. And so I actually do think this is quite significant from the consumer's perspective because they're unlikely to see any relief.
Well, let me just take two quick points. First, from the consumer perspective, we have not seen any inflationary pressures from tariffs. That is null and void.
That is definitely not true.
That is very true.
And my
the true inflation numbers are close to 1% right now. So let's leave that on the table. I just want to say one thing. The semantics of a tax versus a tariff is in question here. All right. The president has the constitutional right to tariff, not to tax. And the
Supreme Court settled that issue, or they answered that point today. And they made it very clear that in this case, a tariff is a tax that is, and both are in the hands of Congress.
And that is not true. A tax and that's semantics.
How is that semantics?
Because we already have the Tariff Law of the Tariff Act of 1962 and 1974, which gives the president the right to control imports via.
Okay, but what is a tariff?
A tariff
What is a tariff?
A tariff is a fee charged to another country.
Okay.
Tax. No, it's not charged to another
That's
country.
the semantics.
Tax on the
Hold on.
That's
A tariff is a what?
It is a fee charged. We cannot tax a foreign country.
A tariff
we can tax
is a
citizens.
fee charged to who?
A foreign country.
No, it is not.
Okay. I'll tell you who pays. Well, I'll answer that. I'm not even an economic expert. The importers. I have a friend who imports T-shirts and sneakers from overseas. He pays the tariff, not China.
Is there any evidence? I can't believe you just said that. Any evidence that a foreign government has paid Donald Trump's tariffs?
We're talking about producers in foreign countries.
Tariffs are paid by who?
Tariffs can be paid by many.
They
can be paid by the importers.
They are paid by companies. Some of them are foreign companies, but some of them are American companies. Here's one corporation. This is actually the plaintiff in this case. Here's what he says he wants to see.
And they know exactly what they took from us, when and why and how much, and they can just reverse the gears and send it back to us. It's our money. They took it unlawfully. They have to return it. And I'm not crying for them that they find it inconvenient.
They said they spent $10 million paying Trump's tariffs that we now know are illegal. And on top of that, just to circle back to what we were talking about, the CBO, this is one of many reports on this, but the CBO just recently said U.S. businesses will absorb 30% of the import price increases by reducing their profit margins. The remaining 70% will be passed through to consumers by raising prices. So the net effect of the tariffs will be to raise consumer prices by the full portion of the cost of the tariffs borne domestically, 95%. So look, at the end of the day, he's a business owner. You can't tell him he didn't bear the cost of tariffs. He wrote the check.
Well, which is it? You said all of it was passed through the consumers. You said that most of it was absorbed by some of the companies. It sounds like maybe it might be a little bit of both. I mean, how you refund this? I have no idea. I mean, this is a total mess. You're talking about massive amount of money.
How did they charge it?
And
they can refund what they charged.
I guess, but if you want to go into the Treasury and start writing checks on this, it feels, and the court acknowledged that it feels like it's going to be a bit of a mess. I assume, Ellie, there'll be massive amount of litigation about this over the next couple of years. I will just say, politically today, it was a big breaking news day, but I just think we ought to acknowledge something. This is a properly functioning government today. The President of the United States, the head of the executive branch, made a policy decision. The Supreme Court, that renders legal opinions about these kinds of decisions, made a decision. They said you can't do that. The President of the United States said, okay, I agree, and I will acknowledge your decision. I am going to use a different statute to try to do what I want to do. This is properly functioning government. And I'll tell you one more thing. for every Democrat and every media person that has gone on for the last year or two about how the Supreme Court is a wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump, that it's not independent, that it does whatever he says to do. Obviously, that narrative was obliterated today. So to me, I thought the ruling was sound. I think the president is sound to try other statutes. And I think the narratives about the court not being independent and the president not obeying the court were totally blown up today.
That was a very charitable explanation of what took place today, Scott. You should be paid a lot of money from the Trump administration for helping to...
Oh, no, I get paid a lot of money here.
Well, I know you
just
do.
to be clear.
And in other places, too. But you should be paid by the Trump administration for what you said, because the reality is that the president didn't just accept the ruling like you said he did.
Yes, he did.
He got up
He
there.
acknowledged it and accepted it.
He got up there in the press conference today, and he attacked the U.S. Supreme Court justices. He said that they should be embarrassed for their families for making a decision that stood up to him. He attacked them and said they were disloyal and unpatriotic. He said they were disloyal to the Constitution even. That's more than disagreement. That's irresponsible rhetoric. And the problem is, Scott, even though today the Supreme Court did the right thing, according to everyone here at the table, apparently, except maybe you, Anthony, the truth is that this is the first major decision where they have actually disagreed with the president on any of his priorities. So yes, they got one right, but that doesn't negate everything else that they've done. Donald Trump doesn't like to govern. Donald Trump likes to rule by decree, and the Supreme Court finally stood in and said you can't do that on this one issue.
Quickly, if I could, I mean, the reason there's not National Guard on the streets in Chicago right now is the Supreme Court blocked that too. And I think Trump's about to go on a bit of a losing streak with the court. I mean, between today, he's going to lose birthright, I believe, birthright citizenship eventually. I also think he's going to lose his effort to fire Lisa Cook off the Fed. So I think, to Scott's point, I think the narrative that the Supreme Court is automatically in Trump's pocket and always has been, I think it is overblown. And I think they're disproving that now and will continue over the next several months.
Yeah, it's interesting because they do push the envelope on this stuff, and they could easily have, to your point, I mean, there are all kinds of different statutory authorities for the president to do all kinds of different things, and he's going to use some of them now. And they could have tried to do it that way. I don't know. Do you have a theory? I have a theory, but I'm curious if you have a theory about why the Trump administration decided to do it this particular way.
Yeah, I have a bit of a theory, which is that of all of the trade authorities that exist to support the president's agenda, this is the one that has the least set of requirements attached to it. It is the one where, with a stroke of a pen on any particular day, and in fact, we've seen it on 60 days so far in this Trump administration, you are able to change tariff rates because you see a commercial you don't like, or your adversary or ally does something that you don't agree with. And I think the challenge with all of these other approaches, some of which would actually require the president to go to Congress and try to legislate the trade agenda, as has always been done historically, don't afford you that same flexibility. And I think that flexibility might sound like it's attractive, but actually, Scott, to your point, I think today you did see government function and our institutions function the way they're supposed to. But something that you also saw was the reintroduction of incredible volatility into our trade policy. What are businesses supposed to be planning for? What is the tariff rate likely to be next week, next month, 6 months from now? How do consumers plan for that? And how do our allies think about us in negotiations when it's not at all clear what authorities or the extent to which they're legally viable pathways to effectuate some of these policies?
I think the last point you made is one of the most important for how the president moves forward here, because if you talk to him about this, beyond just the economics, he believes these tariffs and the ability for him to unilaterally do it is his biggest diplomatic tool. He thinks that it's been huge in trade negotiations. He thinks it's helped him solve some of these peace agreements. He thinks it gives the American president, in any room that that person is in, this massive cudgel against other countries to extract outcomes that we want on a number of fronts. So I think the last point you made is very true.
And he's wrong about that.
Why is he wrong about it?
Chief Justice Roberts said this: the president asserts the extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, and scope. In light of the breadth, history, and constitutional context of that asserted authority, he must identify clear congressional authorization to exercise it. He's pretty crystal clear. That's the scope. There's a reason that, according to Chief Justice Gorsuch and 6 other Supreme Court justices, Congress does not give that power to the president. And it has to do with the fact that, as we just discussed, tariffs, like taxes, cost people money. Money comes out of their pockets and goes to the Treasury. And that is a power that belongs to Congress. And if Congress, which is, controlled by the president's party, supports the president's agenda, and if these tariffs are so popular and such a key to economic prosperity, two questions. Why are they so unpopular? Why do Americans say 56% say they hurt the economy? And why won't Congress just codify them?
So what I would say that, first of all, Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution gives the president the right to work on international affairs, manage international affairs, and trade. Period. Hard stop. He has the right to implement tariffs. That's not the question here. The question is IEEPA. To loop back to the benefits that we've seen.
Did you hear anything that I just read?
I did, but it's
I mean,
actually
listen,
not
I
accurate.
understand what you're saying. In this
They did just rule on the narrow statute, though.
Hold on, just a second. I understand the context of what you're saying in that they're ruling on IEEPA. But what Chief Justice Roberts is saying is that what Trump is asserting is that using national security as a justification to impose tariffs of any size, scope, and duration is not constitutional. He says that very clearly here.
That is IEEPA. That's fine.
Okay. So we're in agreement on that. The president has limited authorities that are delegated by Congress to impose trade restrictions under certain circumstances, under other statutes, but it is not broad, it is not unlimited, and it is not forever. Correct?
No, that's actually not correct. He has congressional authority to issue and implement tariffs under Section 122.
Under limited
They
under
each have
limited
their own limits
scope that
and
is
their own
delegated by Congress. That is the only
Section
point that I'm making.
232, for example, gives him the ability to put tariffs at 50% across the board.
The only point that I'm making is the only point that I'm making is that Congress determines what powers he has in those.
They've already determined that as well.
Anthony, you're making the argument that might have been okay yesterday, but today it lost, so it's not the law anymore.
Elliot, he's saying that there's statutes that already exist.
Oh, I know.
The president's going to pivot to
Which
other
is fine.
statutory authorities.
Yes.
Now, if he does
those
that,
are narrow.
maybe somebody ends up challenging that, and they
Sure,
are
let me
different
make-
scope
let me make-
because the statutes already
You have
exist.
to actually meet the requirements of those statutes.
Right.
He can't just say, I want 50% tariffs on the whole world. I'm just going to put it under this statute. If he could have done that, he would have done it. But he didn't. Those statutes are narrow. He has to meet certain requirements, and those requirements are dictated by Congress, not by the president.
Think about it this way.
So that's the only point.
IEEPA, the law that he tried to use today, would have been a sledgehammer for him to put in tariffs. Instead, that's been taken away, and now he's going to have to use a ball-peen hammer instead. The statutes that are left for him are much more restrictive. Still painful and still effective, but much more fine, much more limited in their scope.
Let's hit. Tonight, it appears that the honeymoon period between President Trump and his handpicked Supreme Court justices is over, at least for two of them. Justices Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch are now officially on Trump's bad list after they sided with the liberal justices to torpedo his tariffs. Now, Trump took that personally and didn't hold back his frustration.
And I'm ashamed of certain members of the court. They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution. They don't want to do the right thing. They're afraid of it. The court meant it because the court doesn't show great spirit toward our country, in my opinion.
Real respect for the institution there on the part of the president. The Wall Street Journal editorial board blasted Trump tonight in an editorial. President Trump owes the Supreme Court an apology to the individual justices he smeared on Friday and to the institution itself. Mr. Trump doubtless won't offer one, but his rant in response to his tariff defeat at the court was arguably the worst moment of his presidency. Scott, I think you were right that this is a moment that illustrates, yes, the wheels of democracy are still turning, but the president, according to the Wall Street Journal, just showed his, other side.
Well, he gets very upset about this topic. I mean, I've talked to him about it, interviewed him about it, and he's certainly spoken about it publicly. This is his longest and most closely held political view, that tariffs are good, that they help the president affect positive outcomes for the country, and the idea that it would be restrained from him is hateful to him. I went back and listened to an interview I did with him on September 2nd of last year, and he was talking about how weak and poor this would make the United States if this ruling were to come down. I listened to his entire press conference today. I was thinking about if I were advising him what I would have told him to do. I almost think I wouldn't have done anything. I think I would have just said, okay, thanks, and signed the executive order for the other statutory.
You would have told him to do nothing.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't have said a word because because they had a plan B. And if you listen to the arguments when they were made, it was obvious the court was headed in this direction. And so part of the way you could have played it today is to simply have done nothing. Said, thank you, Supreme Court. By the way, here are my new statutory authorities, and we were going to re-implement these tariffs. And I believe the way it all shakes out, the rates are all roughly the same. And so that would have been maybe a cooler and more confident way to have played it.
They're the same as, just to be clear, the same as before.
Yeah, my colleagues and I at the budget lab at Yale, we actually just crunched these numbers, and they're coming out tonight. So I can tell you, basically, the effective tariff rate as of this morning before this decision was something like 16.9%. Now it's something like 13.3%. So you're like roughly in the same space. But remember, Scott, this is only for 150 days unless Congress authorizes these tariffs. And so you are at a roughly similar level, but you're not really likely to be there because Congress has already shown explicitly that they're not really likely to go along with this.
And I would also say, and I know you have some responses to him, but just on that, I mean, there are some tariffs that are significantly higher than that. So we average things out and it looks the same. But for certain parts of the world or certain products, it might be a significant difference in rate.
Yeah, I wish the president would have received and followed your advice, Scott. It would have been vastly preferable to what he did. Plenty of presidents have been plenty disappointed by Supreme Court decisions before, but we've never seen someone lash out quite like this, calling the justices individually embarrassments to their families. I couldn't believe he said that. Disgrace to the nation, lapdogs, right? We've never had a president talk like that before. I guess my question, and Scott, maybe you would know, why would he do this? I mean, is it just a temper tantrum? Like, he's not going to influence the justices. There's no way the next time around Amy Coney Barrett or Chief Justice Roberts is going to say, you know, he really intimidated me there. I mean, they have life tenure. They don't care, right? Why does he do this?
I don't know if I agree with you on that, though, even though I know this is a question for Scott.
I want to hear that.
I do think he thinks he can intimidate them, and I do think some of them may be intimidated because even though they have life tenure, they also are getting threats. There are judges who are getting threats from his supporters out there, and they're aware of the political climate in which they live. So I don't know if that's part of what he's doing, but I think that I don't think that he can just assume. You can just assume that he's not saying that.
Vance also called it lawless, which to me raised a question of what law does he think is above the ruling of the Supreme Court?
Well, look, they have a strong political and legal disagreement. It's why they levied the tariffs. It's why they fought it out. It's why they argued what they did in court. And so, and again, this is more than just another ho-hum policy decision that the president made and a stack of other decisions. This is the thing that he cares about the most, which leads to the emotional outburst that he had. It's not true that the justices are simply getting threats from the right. I mean, Justice Kavanaugh was attempted murder by someone from the left. We had Chuck Schumer stand on the front of the Supreme Court and threaten justices by name. You'll reap the whirlwind, if you all will recall. So this is hardly the first time someone's taken on the Supreme Court or raised the specter of threats. I don't think he should attack the Supreme Court. I don't think they can be intimidated. I don't think it works. And I think the court itself, because A, it has a number of his appointees on it, and B, has, I think, distinguished itself as a functioning part of government. I don't think they deserve this kind of abuse. But if you want to know why he did it, it's because he's pissed. This is his number one thing. There's no backing down. He believes in it. He's never wavered on it. He ran on it. This is the thing that defines him apart from other presidents, and that's why he's the president. That's why he did it.
Justice Gorsuch made a comment in his concurring opinion today where he basically said that if you want these tariffs, if you want these policies, go through the proper legislative process.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lesson for Trump. If this is his top priority, why not govern responsibly? Why not try to lead the way presidents are supposed to lead? Why just issue executive orders all the time? It almost feels like he doesn't want to do the hard work of being the president. He just wants to do the quick, to sign the pardon or rename the building or something.
Anthony, one thing. I heard earlier tonight a Republican senator, I think John Kennedy, suggests that if the money went back to the hands of corporations, it would be a massive economic boon for the United States. It could be a win-win situation for President Trump. What do you think?
First of all, I don't know if logistically the money can go back, and the Supreme Court obviously
just to be
left that
clear,
open.
Scott Bessent last month said they have the money, it's in the Treasury. If they needed to do it, they could do it. So
It would be difficult. They're redistributing to, I think, 3,000 recipients or over 3,000 recipients. So, look, the money's in the country, right? So would it be an economic boom? Would it help if we cut the debt and deficit spending? We're doing that. That helps with inflation. That helps with growth.
It's really not doing that, though. Like,
again, I would push back.
It's
I'm watching the
it's a drop in the bucket,
number.
right?
No, but we're moving in the right direction. If we were to decrease the trade deficit, all right, which we're doing, we're decreasing the amount of dollars.
Is up, isn't it?
The trade deficit is coming down.
The trade deficit
the
we have,
net
we have
exports
it,
is actually a huge input to GDP, which is
the trade deficit, according to 2025, is virtually the same as it was in 2024. The trade deficit for goods is higher than it was before the tariffs. So I'm not seeing where Trump is economically winning here, but I guess the question was, if you give companies back the $130-something billion that were taken out of their balance sheets, could that actually help reverse some of the weirdness in the economy that we've been seeing over the last year?
I guess in theory, if the money was going back into the economy and not being sent overseas, sure, that could be.
I mean, just to be clear, I can answer a version of this question. So the way that these tariffs are collected, they're collected by those at the ports, by those who are actually bringing in goods into this country, that is American companies. And so if you believe that if you cut taxes for American companies, you see an investment boon, then you believe a version of what Senator Kennedy said, which is that as a result of refunding potentially $140 billion in tariffs, that's going to trickle into the economy in ways that are going to grow it. The thing that pushes in the opposite direction of that is that these tariffs have ultimately been passed down to the American consumer, at least in part, Scott, and that's what estimates say. Somewhere between 50 to 70% of these tariffs are falling on the American consumer in the form of higher prices. That's inflationary. That's bad for the economy, and that won't be negated by any small investment types of increases that you're seeing on the margins as a result of these importers ultimately being able to profit.
President Trump has just endured one of the biggest blows to any president's agenda in modern American history. The blockbuster decision by the Supreme Court struck at the heart of his philosophy when it comes to presidential power, that for him, essentially, there are no limits. The court, though, including conservatives and two of his own nominees to the high court, ruled otherwise, resulting in the president furiously accusing them of being unpatriotic.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices. They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats, and not that this should have anything at all to do with it. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution. It's my opinion that the court has been swayed by foreign interests. I think it's an embarrassment to their families. You want to know the truth, the two of them.
If you thought he was just blowing off steam, that screed continued against the justices, even in On Truth Social tonight, with the president naming some of them directly and adding at one point, "At least I didn't appoint Roberts," in reference to the Chief Justice, John Roberts, who wrote that majority opinion today. The Wall Street Journal editorial board says the president has gone too far in those comments you just heard. They say he owes an apology to the individual justices that he smeared on Friday and the institution itself. Adding, quote, "Mr. Trump doubtless won't offer one, but his rant and response to his tariff defeat at the court was arguably the worst moment of his presidency." The two justices that the president was describing as an embarrassment to their families, that's Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch. They were both appointed to the court by President Trump. They joined with the Chief Justice and the court's progressives in that 6-3 decision, finding that what's known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act did not authorize the president to unilaterally impose his tariffs, any tariffs actually. The president had a very different tone, though, when it came to his other pick to the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh, the justice who dissented and might have written the president a roadmap when it comes to Plan B for his tariffs.
As Justice Kavanaugh, whose stock has gone so up, you have to see, I'm so proud of him, wrote in his dissent, "Although I firmly disagree with the court's holding today the decision might not substantially constrain a president's ability to order tariffs going forward. Today, I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged.
Tonight, he's done just that, writing, "It is my great honor to have just signed from the Oval Office a global 10% tariff on all countries, which will be effective almost immediately." Unlike the tariffs that were just struck down today, these new tariffs can only be in place for 150 days max before they have congressional approval. But the president said today he doesn't think that he'll need Congress.
There's several Republicans have said that.
Yeah,
a few people. You just work with Congress to come up with a plan.
I don't have to
push tariffs.
I have
through.
the right to do tariffs, and I've always had the right to do tariffs, and it's all been approved by Congress, so there's no reason to do it.
That brings us to the $134 billion question tonight. Refunds to American consumers and businesses who have paid these tariffs, which are taxes on the businesses and the consumers. Several governors, senators, and state attorneys general are already demanding that the Trump administration begin to pay everyone back. The Illinois governor, J.B. Pritzker, posted an $8.6 billion invoice saying he is billing the president on behalf of every family in Illinois. When asked about the possibility of refunds, something the White House has been grappling with behind the scenes in light of today's ruling, the president indicated that people should not hold their breath.
They take months and months to write an opinion, and they don't even discuss that point. We've taken in hundreds of billions of dollars, not millions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so I said, well, what happens to all the money that we took in? It wasn't discussed. Wouldn't you think they would have put one sentence in there saying that keep the money or don't keep the money, right? I guess it has to get litigated for the next 2 years.
My lead source tonight is the Democratic Senator of Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren. And thank you, Senator, for being here. I want to ask you about what is going to happen to the money in a moment. But first off, just in your view, what message does this ruling from the Supreme Court today send?
Well, the Supreme Court has said that even Donald Trump has to abide by the law. You know, the majority opinion here is not very fancy. It's no surprise to anybody who's listened to the arguments. It's no surprise to anybody who's read the law. And that is that Donald Trump does not have the ability, no president has the ability, just to go around and say, I don't like you, your tariffs are high. I'm mad at you, your tariffs will be even higher. Keep a dictator out of jail or I will raise your tariffs. He doesn't have that power. He doesn't have that power under the law. And it took us a year to get here. But finally, the Supreme Court unequivocally has said Donald Trump does not have that power. And that means the money that he has collected has been stolen from the American people. It has been stolen from the businesses that paid those tariffs, stolen from the businesses that then passed those costs along to the American consumers. And what the Trump administration should have been doing over the past several months, knowing that this opinion was coming, is start putting in place a way to refund the money directly to the American families who've paid for it.
So you think that they should refund that $140 billion?
I'm sorry, when somebody takes money from you illegally, that's called stealing in the United States. And the first rule is you got to give the money back. That money was not legally taken from the American people. It was stolen by Donald Trump. And make no mistake that it has been the American consumer is the one that has paid. The studies show over 90% of the costs of these tariffs have been borne by American families. Well, it's time for American families to get their money back, and it's up to the Trump administration to make that happen.
Well, we heard from one of the top officials in the Trump administration on this. That's the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. Here's what he said about this.
Well, it's going to be a food fight going after $175 billion in it. So
I got a feeling the American people won't see it.
So now what?
Yeah. Did you see his smirk? I mean, that just seems to be what Scott Bessent thinks his job is just to please Donald Trump and get out there and perform for Donald Trump. It is the job of the Secretary of the Treasury to put in place a way for the American people to get the money that was illegally taken from them. That is Scott Bessent's job. And for him to sit there and, put his fingers together and smirk about the fact that the American people have lost on average somewhere around $1,500, $1,800, $2,000 per family, and that's just okay with him because he sure doesn't intend to send it back, that is fundamentally wrong. Scott Bessent is not there just to lick the boots of Donald Trump. He is there to represent the people of the United States of America and to give them back their money.
If they were going to give the money back, which, the president said today, this is going to be litigated for 5 years in his view. I don't think he's wrong that to rightly point out that the Supreme Court didn't say what should happen here. But if they were going to do this, I think a question is, what would that look like? Would the money go to the businesses? Would it go to the consumers who paid the tariffs if they were passed on to them? How would that even work?
Well, let's be clear. It should not just go to a handful of giant corporations who have the legal capacity to go in and sue the federal government. In that case, they win twice. That is, that they get the tariff refund, but they also got the higher prices when they pass those tariff costs along. This money needs to go back to the American people. The studies are out there now. They show the American people are the ones who actually paid the cost. And yeah, we've done refunds before. This is an opportunity to give this money back to the American people. And right now, it is the responsibility of the Treasury Department to sit down and work out a plan to give that money back to American families. This is not rocket science. Give them back the money. You know how much you took in. You know that American families paid for it. Give them back the money.